Have you ever imagined a moment when a quiet street suddenly shudders under a sharp auctioneer's cry, where a human life is sold off like a horse or a mule? Men jostle shoulder to shoulder, silver coins flashing, dry laughter rattling through their teeth and on the rough wooden platform. A woman stands tall, her gaze refusing to bow. Friends, that's no imagination. That is the opening of a story, steeped in oppression and outrage, one I am about to tell you about. Before we ride deeper into this tale, make sure you hit that like button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what keeps these frontier stories alive, and I promise the turns ahead will hold your attention, because they touch the deepest corners of justice and human dignity. The setting is Cedar Crossing, on a cold morning when breath curled like smoke above the crowd. Behind the freight house, Griff Cobb had cleared his yard into an auction pen. Old planks, nails sticking out, but good enough to stage cruelty. Boots thumped, silver clinked, and the auctioneer's voice cut the air. Each number stretched long and sharp as a blade. On that platform stood Tala Nez, a deerskin dress torn at the hip and shoulder, exposing where rough hands had caught her. But what unsettled the crowd was her eyes. They wanted her to sag, to look down, to show shame. She didn't. Her spine stayed straight, the one part of her body no rope, no jeer, no price could bend. Most of the men that day weren't buyers at all. They came for spectacle, for the bitter sport of breaking a woman with stares and laughter. The smell of sweat, tobacco, and lust hung thick in the air, and in it lived the kind of anger that rises in anyone who still knows what dignity means. Off to the edge of the crowd stood Rhett Callahan, a widowed rancher, in town for nothing more than salt, nails, and a coil of wire. But the chant of numbers pulled him closer. Rhett hadn't planned to meddle. He knew all too well that stepping into such business could make enemies that outlast a season. Yet when Tala's eyes met his cold, steady, unbroken, he could not turn away. Old wounds stirred in him, the bullet crease in his thigh that ached in winter winds, the scar across his knuckles from a brawl long past. He saw in Tala the same fight he once carried, a soul beaten down by the world, but unwilling to surrender its name. The auctioneer barked. Griff Cobb tossed numbers like dice. Coins slid between hands. A laugh rose when the bid stayed pitifully low, as if Tala's worth was no more than a mule's hide. A man at the front raised his hand, grinning hard, smirking wide. The yard answered with jeers. Then another hand lifted Rhett Callahan's. His voice put down a figure high enough to cut through the noise, high enough to strip the sport out of bidding. The crowd stilled. Griff Cobb stumbled, tried to coax more play, but no man there wanted to bleed his purse for a morning's amusement. The gavel dropped, sharp and final. A bill of sale, still smelling of damp ink, was pushed into Rhett's hand. He looked at it once, then tore it clean down the middle. The halves fluttered into the dust. No words were needed. Every man watching knew this buyer had not come to claim property, but to end a disgrace. Sheriff Amos Hart stood under the porch eave, hat low, eyes wide. When Rhett's gaze touched his, Hart spoke only 2 words: "Keep it peaceable." It was both warning and permission. A couple of men tensed at the rails, but when Hart's palm settled slow on the butt of his revolver, their courage melted. Tala stepped down from the platform. She did not reach for Rhett's hand, nor did she whisper thanks. Gratitude wasn't owed not for breathing free. She simply walked with her chin level, moving past the boy who half-heartedly offered his arm to feel generous. Rhett didn't grab, didn't shove. He turned, opened a path through the crowd, and she walked beside him. The rancher who had shattered the paper claim and the woman who refused to bend together, they left Cedar Crossing's shameful yard. That scene, friends, was no small matter. It was the crack of thunder before the storm. It was the moment when silence split, when one man's coin and one woman's defiance drew a line in the dirt. And it was only the beginning of a journey that will bring you face to face with outrage, with the long shadow of oppression, and with the fragile spark of hope that can survive even in the harshest land. There are moments out on the frontier when all the noise suddenly collapses into a strange kind of silence. Just minutes earlier, the crowd had been jeering, whistling, trading filthy jokes. But when Rhett Callahan ripped that bill of sale in half and let the pieces fall into the dust, the sound of paper tearing was louder than the gavel itself. It cut the air so sharply that every half-formed taunt died on the tongue. And in that silence, the footsteps of Rhett and Tala rang out like drums steady, defiant, carrying them away from the cruelty of the yard. Sheriff Amos Hart still leaned beneath the porch eave, eyes half-lidded under the brim of his hat. He didn't step forward, didn't shout, but the way he stood motionless, hand resting light on the butt of his Colt, built a wall no man wanted to test. His stillness was enough. It told the yard that if anyone pushed this farther, the sheriff would be ready to finish it. Rhett walked slow, breath even. He didn't yank Tala along, didn't glance over his shoulder to see if someone followed. He knew better show fear, and the wolves would pounce. Instead, he moved with a calm weight, shoulders square, forcing the crowd to open a path. Tala kept pace beside him, deerskin torn, chin lifted. She would not run. She would not give them that satisfaction. Whispers rose behind them. "Who does he think he is? Hauling that squaw home? We'll see about that." But the mutters stayed small. The sheriff's cold stare slid over the men, and suddenly no one wanted to be the first to test it. The silence itself became heavy, pressing down on the street. Cedar Crossing's main road stretched pale in the morning light. Wind dragged dust through the boardwalks, carrying the smoke of half-burnt cigars from saloons not yet open. A few townsfolk lingered under awnings, watching. They didn't cheer, didn't spit, didn't nod approval. They only watched with that peculiar frontier distance, as if witnessing something beyond their circle of belonging. Rhett led the way to the hitch rail, calloused hand steady on the reins. He guided Tala toward the spare mare he'd left ready, careful not to fumble. Tala's eyes swept the windows, the alleys, the half-faces hiding in shadow. She was used to stares, to being measured like prey. But this time, the man beside her was different. He stood as a shield, not a chain. Near the horses, a broad-shouldered ranch hand spat in the dirt and stepped into their path. The air tightened like a drawn bow. Rhett said nothing. He only looked once, flat, steady, long enough for the man to feel it. Then Rhett turned away. The ranch hand froze, fight draining out of him. That silence was sharper than any threat. From the porch. Sheriff Hart shifted his stance. The slight roll of his shoulder was enough. The big man backed off, muttering, slipping toward the saloon. Once again, no bullets, no raised voices, just the sheriff's presence keeping the peace by sheer weight, at the rail. Rhett untied his horse and the spare. He placed the reins in Tala's hand. The rope bit against her raw wrist, but it was no longer a shackle. She mounted smooth, pulling the coat he'd given her close around her shoulders. They didn't exchange thanks. None was needed. Words would only weaken the solemn edge of what had just happened. The town of Cedar Crossing watched. The crowd that had howled minutes ago now stared in silence as two horses stepped out. Hooves struck the packed dirt in a steady rhythm. Behind them, suspicion clung to every doorway, every face, ahead. The road opened wide. Rhett didn't look back. Tala didn't either. They knew leaving Cedar Crossing wasn't just walking away from an auction block. It was stepping out from under the judgment of a whole community. The silence that wrapped them was heavy, but it was also cover. Alien. Yes, but also the mark of a beginning. And in that strangeness, in that quiet distance, something new had already taken root. A journey. A bond, not yet named, but carried forward in the sound of hooves fading down the open road. The road out of Cedar Crossing wasn't much more than a strip of hard earth running beside the dry bed of Willow Run. Pebbles caught the weak sun, glittering pale, and the wind carried a faint smoke from the town they'd left behind. Rhett Callahan rode half a length ahead, broad shoulders squared, dust on his coat, eyes measuring every bend. Tala Nez sat the spare mare, back straight, her hand light on the reins, though her fingers trembled. Silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the steady drum of hooves. Tala was no stranger to silence, but this silence was different. Not the kind that cages a person, waiting for commands. This was the silence of two people still weighing whether they could trust each other. At the bend in the trail, Rhett finally spoke, his voice low. Steady. You don't owe me a thing. Not work, not promise, not company. You can walk away whenever you choose. Tala tilted her head, eyes sharp as a knife. Men had spoken kindly before, promised freedom, only to tighten the rope twice over. She didn't rush to believe. Instead, she studied him. Did his gaze slide toward the torn collar of her dress? Did his fingers tap restless against the colt at his hip? Any sign of hunger or deceit? But Rhett kept his eyes forward, hands steady on the reins. His bearing spoke louder than his words, a man shaped by loss and war, living now not by taking, but by restraint. Tala drew a long breath, fighting to steady her pulse. Doubt still burned in her chest. Her grandmother's voice echoed, "Don't trust a man's words. Trust his footsteps." Rhett's footsteps were hooves now, measured, unhurried, straight on the trail. Willow Run glimmered ahead, a silver thread cutting the valley floor. The water was clear, cold as glass. Rhett pulled up, giving the horses a rest. He offered Tala his canteen, his hand careful, keeping distance, no accidental touch. "Drink," he said simply. No pressure, no expectant look. Tala took it slow, eyes locked on him as if daring him to break the moment with a claim. But Rhett only bent to check his saddle straps, tugging them tight with calm precision. His movements were plain, unadorned, and oddly steadying. Her wariness didn't vanish, but something shifted. Could this be no trap? Could he mean what he said, that she owed him nothing? The thought flared, then guttered beneath habit, but not before it cracked the wall. She had built around herself. They rode on. Tala noticed how Rhett always held his place just ahead, close enough to shield, far enough not to crowd. He spoke little, only short. Practical reminders. Watch your footing there. Duck under the branch, not orders. Cautions, shaped by habit. Her throat was dry, her nerves wound tight, and yet beneath the suspicion she felt the faintest trace of difference. Unlike the men who had taken her before, Rhett did not weigh her as property. He did not prod her like a burden. She let her shoulders drop once, testing the air, then drew them taut again, scolding herself for daring to ease. The trail toward Dry Creek Ranch ran long, the mountains rising pale blue at the horizon. Every hoofbeat seemed to pound the question into her chest, was this man truly different? For now, there was no answer. Only a promise dropped into the open air. You don't owe me a thing. A promise Tala wanted to believe, yet feared believing, most of all. The sun had dropped low by the time Rhett Callahan turned off the narrow trail toward Dry Creek Ranch. The path wound between thickets of willow, their dark leaves shivering in the wind. Ahead, the outline of a weathered cabin rose, its roof silvered by sun and storm, a thin ribbon of smoke curling from the chimney. To Tala Nez, it was the shape of a place where people still held warmth, She sat tall in the saddle, her eyes measuring everything: the peeling corral rails, the stone well with a warped plank across it, the gray dog that padded out onto the porch, barking once before falling quiet, as though it already knew the master's step. Rhett tied the horses in the corral, steady hands on the knots, then swung the cabin door open. He didn't motion for Tala to enter first, didn't touch her arm. He simply pushed the heavy wood aside and said, "Go on in. Not much here, but it's solid." His voice was flat, matter of fact. Inside was plain a small kitchen, a square table with 2 chairs, a black iron stove glowing faintly, shelves with a few bowls and tin cups. No trace of a woman's hand remained. Tala's gaze circled the room, alert, weighing each corner like a scout marking exits. Rhett gestured toward the door opposite the stove. "That room's yours. Latch is on the inside. I never kept a key." He stayed where he stood, leaving the space between them open. Tala crossed to the door, ran her hand over the bolt, and slid it once. The sound of wood catching on wood was solid. True, for the first time in months. A flicker of safety pressed into her chest. Supper was simple beans, dry bread, a strip of salt pork. Rhett set out 2 portions as if it were routine. Tala sat opposite him, her eyes still sweeping the room. As she raised her spoon, he said, "Slow and even eat, no debt, no bargain, just supper." The words built a fence. Tala ate in silence, each bite small, while she studied him. The way he cut bread in even strokes, the way he angled the knife away from her, the way he chewed without hurry, as if long used to solitude. Every small detail spoke louder than any oath he knew how to keep distance. After the meal, Rhett wiped the table, rinsed the plates, and lit a lamp. The warm glow softened the cabin's edges. He sat, not staring, not avoiding her either. "I'll sleep in the other room. Door stays open. If you hear something you don't like, bolt yours. In the morning you decide whether to stay or go." Tala looked down at her wrists, raw and red in the lamplight. The wounds reminded her that freedom was fragile. She studied him longer, waiting for a slip, a hunger in his gaze. None came. He sat steady, shoulders squared, eyes untroubled. The house was quiet, so quiet she could hear the wind combing the shutters, the dog turning over on the porch. She rose and stepped into her room. The door shut with a soft groan, the latch sliding firm. That sound filled her lungs deeper than any prayer. For one night at least. No hand could force its way in without her leave. The room was bare, a narrow bed, a patched quilt, a crooked chest, a frosted window pane. Yet to Tala it felt like a fortress. She touched the latch once more, then sat on the edge of the bed, heart still racing. Safe, perhaps. But safety like this was thin as lamp flames, steady only until the next wind blew. Out in the main room, Rhett kept to his chair. He didn't lean toward her door, didn't listen. He only fed the stove, keeping the heat alive. The distance between them was thick as a wall. And yet for this first night, that very distance was what gave both of them room to breathe. And in that fragile quiet, something else stirred. Not promises, not binding words, just the plain fact of a door that could be latched from the inside. The first night at Dry Creek Ranch stretched longer than Tala Nez expected. Outside, the wind stirred the shutters. The old dog shifted on the porch, and the stove cracked and sighed with each burning log. In the small room, Tala lay on her side, eyes wide open, hand resting on the latch as though she needed to remind herself it was really there. But slowly, in that fragile stillness, fear began to loosen its grip. A faint sound from the kitchen drew her up. Not hurried boots, not the pounding at doors she knew too well, just the scratch of pencil on paper, the soft slide of a chair. She eased the door open. Rhett Callahan sat at the square table, a worn ledger spread before him. the lamplight washing his face in warm gold. He wrote a line or two, then paused, as if each word cost him something to set down. Tala stepped out. The floorboards creaked under her bare feet. Rhett looked up, but he didn't startle. He only nodded, as though her leaving the room was the most natural thing in the world. "Can't sleep." His voice was deep, steady, without judgment. She didn't answer at once. Instead, she pulled out the opposite chair and sat down. For a moment, the room held them both in a strange new balance. Two strangers, each carrying the weight of loss, now sharing the quiet of a single lamp. It was Rhett who spoke first, slowly, as though the words had to climb over scars. He told of the wife and unborn child he'd buried when sickness swept the land, of a war that left him with a wound in his leg and a weariness that never healed. He didn't speak to gain pity. He spoke because silence sometimes grows heavier than pain itself. Tala listened, her eyes tracing the lines in his weathered face. Inside her chest, something softened when he fell silent. She answered in a low voice, "I lost my family too. Not to sickness, but to violence and betrayal. I learned to keep my spine straight, even with ropes around my wrists, but standing tall doesn't mean it didn't hurt." The words hung in the small room like first drops of rain falling on dry earth, tentative, unfamiliar, but necessary. After a while, Rhett set the pencil down and lifted his gaze. His eyes shone steady in the lamplight. He didn't offer empty comfort. He only said, "No one has the right to take your name. No one." The force of it struck like a nail hammered into timber, sharp and final. Silence followed, deep enough for Tala's heartbeat to steady. And then, half reckless, half natural, she leaned across the table. Their lips met in a brief kiss, so quiet it might have been mistaken for the wind outside. No clutching hands, no claim, just proof that both were still alive, still capable of feeling. After everything, Rhett pulled back first, his expression unchanged. He shook his head slightly and said, his voice calm but firm, "Every decision is yours. Tala, tomorrow, if you want to leave, I'll take you. If you want to stay, this house will have a latch you can set yourself." For the first time in months. Tala looked at a man not with suspicion, but with measured consideration. Her walls did not fall, but a crack of light had opened. That night. They sat a while longer, listening to the wind and the stove's quiet sigh. No grand speeches, no heavy vows, only presence, sympathy, and a single kiss just enough to begin trust. Morning at Dry Creek Ranch began with dew clinging to the grass and a thin veil of mist still hanging along the willow line. Tala Nez stepped onto the porch, her hand brushing the cold rail. Her heartbeat was calmer than the night before, yet her mind was strung tight. She knew this day would not resemble any other that had come before. Rhett Callahan had the horses ready before first light. He didn't waste words, just gave a short nod toward the road into Cedar Crossing. In that nod was everything he had no intention of hiding, no thought of letting things remain in shadow. He meant for the world to see clear and public. Cedar Crossing was still damp with morning when they stopped before the courthouse, a square red brick building with heavy doors and a faded sign. Edwin Farnham, the aging clerk, looked up from his desk when Rhett and Tala stepped inside. Behind his round spectacles flickered a brief surprise, quickly smoothed into the cool face of a man used to recording lives in black ink. Rhett laid down several coins, his voice for a marriage license. Farnham pulled out a thick ledger, turned to a blank page, and asked for names, ages, place of residence. Rhett answered first, steady and precise. Then he stepped back, giving room for Tala. Her voice wavered at the start, but soon grew stronger. Tala Nez, 24, residing at Dry Creek Ranch, 12 miles north of Cedar Crossing. Farnham's eyes lifted for a moment, as though to fix the sight of an Apache woman daring to speak her own name aloud. Then he bent to write it down. The clerk's stamp pressed into the paper, ink bleeding along the lines, and then came the seal of red wax at the edge, a mark that carried more weight than any word spoken in the dusty yard days before. Their bond was no longer rumor or spectacle. It was set down in law. They didn't stop there. Rhett led Tala across the street to Boone Chapel, the little pinewood church at the far end of town. The bell hadn't rung yet, but Reverend Silas Boone waited at the door, his wife Alma at his side with a shawl draped over her shoulders. Sheriff Amos Hart stood nearby as well, hat tipped low, eyes sharp as ever. Inside, colored glass cast slanted light across the wooden floor. Tala stood straight, her shoulders taut as Reverend Boone opened his small book and asked in an even voice, "Do you come of your own will, without force or fear, to take Rhett Callahan as your husband?" The chapel held its breath. Tala turned her head toward Rhett. He didn't urge her forward, didn't look away. He only waited, gray-blue eyes steady, reminding her that the choice was hers alone. And Tala, after everything she had endured, lifted her chin and answered clear, "I do." The words rang out, not just in the little chapel but in the hearts of those who stood witness. Alma Boone's smile carried the quiet joy of someone who sees new life springing on barren ground. Sheriff Hart shifted his weight, hand brushing the butt of his Colt, not in threat, but in promise. If anyone meant to interrupt, they would go through him first. The ceremony moved forward. Rhett slipped a plain silver ring onto Tala's hand. No speeches, no show, just a nod, a steady grip, and her name written true upon the page. She signed without hesitation, her hand steady as she pressed her letters into ink. The red wax seal came down once more, this time under both their names and those of the witnesses. That paper stood like a wall against whispers, a shield against every doubting glance. It wasn't just paper. It was the declaration that they were husband and wife, recognized by law and community alike. When they stepped out into the street again, the sun had climbed higher, burning through the mist. Tala breathed deep, her shoulders finally loosening. On her finger, the silver ring caught the light not as a chain, but as a mark freely chosen. She was no longer a woman forced onto an auction block. She was a wife, with her name spoken and her place affirmed before God and man. At the corner, a few townsfolk lingered, watching in silence. Their eyes no longer carried scorn, but a grudging respect. In a land as hard as this, any man and woman who dared to stand before the law and say "I do" had spoken louder than gossip ever could. When they returned to Dry Creek Ranch, afternoon light was already stretching across the fields. Sunlight poured long over the dry grass, and the steady beat of hooves on hard ground sounded like the drum roll of a new beginning. No more heavy procedures. No more prying eyes from town, just open land, a plain wooden house, and two people who now stood as husband and wife for all to see. Rhett Callahan dismounted first, holding the gate so Tala Nez could step through. Old Pike, the dog, bounded forward barking loud, then dropped his voice as though he too sensed something had changed. Tala bent down and placed her hand on his head, a small gesture, yet enough to tell Rhett she was finally letting herself ease. They went straight to work. The south fence had leaned all winter. Rhett took the hammer, driving nails into fresh posts, while Tala braced the timbers, her shoulders taut with strength. Each strike of the hammer echoed like a vow this place would hold, not only by wood and iron, but by the will of two people who had just signed their names to a marriage bond. When the fence stood straight again, they both stepped back to look. Their eyes met, and in that look was more than satisfaction. It was trust that the days ahead would be built by their hands together. As evening drew on, Tala walked to the back field and marked fresh rows for planting. She stretched a cord to line them true, her steps slow and careful. Humming a low Apache song her grandmother had taught her to keep her hands steady. Rhett heard it from a distance. He didn't know the words, but he understood the peace in them. Taking up a hoe, he joined her. Together they turned the earth and pressed dried beans into the soil. Small seeds, buried in cold ground, but they both knew when green shoots broke through, the whole ranch would change. The next day, Rhett built a bench under the porch roof. He was used to working alone, but now there were hands passing nails, steadying boards, and sometimes a quiet laugh when he fumbled a joint. When the bench was finished, Tala tried it first. Her shawl spilled down the step, her dark hair falling loose, and for the first time the weathered house looked like a home. Later, Rhett brought out a cedar box he had carved the winter before. He placed the marriage paper inside, red seal still fresh, and pushed the box toward Tala. "It belongs to both of us," he said. She closed the lid, running her hand over the smooth wood. In that moment, she knew what had once been fragile now had a place to rest, safe and firm. That evening, they sat on the new bench, watching the sun sink behind the ridge. Neither spoke much. Only silence, the steady breathing of Pike on the step, and the wide field glowing gold. But in that silence was a shared knowing today had opened a new chapter. Tala leaned her head against Rhett's shoulder. He stiffened at first, then stayed still, afraid any movement might shatter the fragile peace in his chest. A man who had lost too much felt a simple hope rise. This house was no longer a refuge of loneliness. It was becoming a home. And Tala, once bound with rope and shoved onto an auction block beneath cruel stairs, now sat under a porch roof, listening to the night wind through the willows, and understood she had chosen rightly. No one could force her anymore. She had spoken "I do" by her own will, and now she was shaping her future with each stroke of the hoe, each planted seed, each fitted board. That night, the ranch house glowed with lamplight well into the dark. Its warm shine spilled through the windows like a quiet proclamation to the valley here lived people. Here was life. Here was hope. And in the hearts of two souls sitting side by side on the porch, a true home had begun to take root. In the days following their wedding, Dry Creek Ranch carried a different air. Each morning, as the sun climbed over the ridges and scattered light across the damp fence posts, Tala Nez Callahan stepped onto the porch and let her hand rest on the wooden bench they had built together. She had never imagined a house could feel this calm. No longer a shelter of necessity. No longer a cage, this ranch was now home. A place she could walk into freely, with her head held high. Word of their marriage spread faster than spring wind. Cedar Crossing was a small town. Every whisper, every tale, traveled quick. Some doubted, others scoffed. But to Tala's surprise, many faces that once kept their distance now offered a nod of respect. Sheriff Amos Hart, who had witnessed the vows, made no secret of his support. One afternoon he sat on their porch, hat in hand, and said slowly, "You spoke I do before God, before the law, and before this community. From here on, the name Tala Nez Callahan is written in the book, and anyone who forgets it will answer to me first." Few words, but they carried the weight of a shield. It told the valley that this marriage was no passing gesture. It was law. It was truth. And it would be defended. Not long after, Mrs. Hattie Crowell, the dressmaker, and one of the most respected women in town, came out to the ranch. She carried a bolt of brown cloth and a tin of needles. When Tala opened the door, Hattie laid the fabric on the table and said, "They call you Callahan now, girl. And a woman bearing that name deserves proper clothes, not the rags those men left you in." She sat down beside Tala, guiding her through each stitch. In that moment, she gave more than fabric, she gave recognition. When word spread that Hattie Crowell stood by Tala, the sharpness of the town's glances began to soften. Life on the ranch settled into rhythm. Hammer on posts, chickens in the yard, pike barking at visitors, quiet talk over supper. Rhett and Tala shared chores evenly. He tended the stock. She worked the garden, and together they lit fires, cooked beans, and washed dishes. In that simplicity, their bond grew steady. One evening, Tala stood on the porch, eyes on the rows of young beans sprouting green through the earth. The tiny leaves trembled in the breeze, living proof of renewal. She turned to Rhett and whispered, "Do you see we're planting life, not just in this soil, but in ourselves?" Rhett gave a rare smile, not a mask, not a show of strength, but a true release. He laid his hand gently on her shoulder. No words were needed. The touch spoke for him. Their story was no longer only about love. It was about rebirth of a man who thought his life was bound to loneliness, and of a woman once treated as property. Together, they had rebuilt a home from ashes. And friends, those of you listening now, doesn't that strike something deep in your own heart? Even with silver hair and tired hands, don't we still believe life can give second chances? If you feel that same hope for Rhett and Tala, let them know. Leave a word of blessing, a comment of encouragement. Every voice of support is a spark that keeps frontier stories like this alive. What comes next for them does not need to be grand. Their next steps should be steady mending fences, planting beans, stitching new dresses, sitting side by side on the porch as the sun sets. It is in those repeated acts that love puts down roots, and hope grows strong like the beans in the garden. Dry Creek Ranch was no longer the cold house of a lonely widower. It was a home where the name Tala Nez Callahan was spoken with respect, where the town's leaders offered protection, and where two wounded souls found peace. Proof that hope never dies so long as someone dares to guard it. At night, the ranch windows glowed with lamplight. A quiet proclamation to the valley: here was love. Here was renewal. Here was family. And you, dear listener, are witness to their journey.